The summer of 1858 hit London like a punishment from God. Temperatures climbed to 35 degrees Celsius, extraordinary for England, and stayed there, week after week, baking a city of nearly 3 million people. The River Thames, which ran through the heart of the greatest empire on earth, had by that summer become something that no one could quite put into words. It was not a river anymore. It hadn't been a river for years. It was a slow-moving mass of human excrement, animal remains, industrial waste, slaughterhouse blood, and decomposing matter stretching from one end of the city to the other. And in that heat, it fermented, it baked, it produced a smell so extraordinary, so total, so physically overwhelming, that people walking near the riverbanks vomited in the street. Horses bolted, businesses closed, tourists turned around and went home. The smell reached Parliament. The brand new Houses of Parliament, rebuilt at enormous expense after the fire of 1834, positioned right on the bank of the Thames, were so saturated with the stench that MPs could not work. They soaked the curtains in chloride of lime trying to mask it. It didn't work. Benjamin Disraeli, Chancellor of the Exchequer and leader of the House of Commons, walked out of a committee meeting holding a handkerchief over his face, described later as looking like a man fleeing a burning building. There was serious discussion about moving Parliament out of Westminster entirely, about abandoning the building. The newspapers called it the Great Stink, and it was the single event that broke the deadlock of decades, that forced the most powerful government in the world to finally do something about what its own capital city had become. What followed was the most ambitious, most expensive, most technically extraordinary engineering project in Victorian England. A project that would bury 1,300 miles of sewer tunnels beneath a city that had never planned for them, that would require 318 million bricks, that would take 16 years to complete, and that would, without anyone fully understanding why at the time, save more lives than almost any medical intervention of the century. This is how it happened. To understand why the Great Stink was possible, why the most powerful city in the world was drowning in its own waste, you have to understand what London had become in the first half of the 19th century. In 1800, London had a population of just over 1 million people. By 1850, it had nearly 3 million. The city had grown at a speed that no infrastructure could match. People poured in from the countryside, from Ireland, from everywhere, drawn by the factories and the docks and the possibility of work. They crowded into the old medieval street grid, into buildings that had been built for a fraction of the population now occupying them, into neighborhoods that had no running water, no drainage, no sanitation of any kind. Beneath every house, in the ground, was a cesspit, a brick-lined hole in the earth where human waste collected. In theory, night soil men, workers who operated exclusively after dark, came around regularly to empty these pits, carrying the contents away in sealed carts to be sold as agricultural fertilizer. In theory. In practice, the night soil men had been going out of business since the 1840s, when cheap fertilizer began arriving from South America and the market for London excrement collapsed. The cesspits weren't being emptied. They were filling up, overflowing, seeping through walls into basements, running into gutters, flowing into the street. In the poorest neighborhoods, the situation was beyond description. Houses built around shared courtyards had communal cesspits that sat open in the center of the yard, surrounded by the doors and windows of the homes of dozens of families. In winter, the cold kept the smell manageable. In summer, it was a different world. Children played feet from open pools of human waste. Women drew water from wells dug into ground saturated with sewage. Families cooked and ate and slept in rooms whose floors were, in the most literal sense, built above shit. London also had sewers, hundreds of them, over 360 separate sewer systems, built piecemeal over centuries, maintained by different authorities following no consistent design, draining into each other in ways that no one had ever mapped or coordinated. These sewers had originally been built to carry rainwater, surface runoff from streets and rooftops. They were not designed for human waste. They were not sealed. They were not treated. And they emptied, every one of them, directly into the Thames. In 1847, a well-intentioned official named Edwin Chadwick made everything dramatically worse. As head of the Metropolitan Commission of Sewers, Chadwick ordered that all cesspits in London be closed and that every house drain be connected to the existing sewer network. His reasoning was sanitary: get the waste out of the houses, get it into the sewers, get it away from people. His understanding of how disease actually spread was catastrophically wrong, because all 360 sewer systems emptied into the Thames. And the Thames was also London's primary source of drinking water. In one administrative decision, Chadwick had turned the city's water supply into its sewage outfall. The cholera epidemic that followed in 1848 and 1849 killed 14,000 Londoners. The one in 1853 killed another 10,000. The connection between the contaminated water and the deaths was not officially medically, institutionally understood. The prevailing theory of disease at the time held that illness was caused by miasma. Foul air, bad smells, poisonous vapors rising from decaying organic matter. If you could get rid of the smell, you would get rid of the disease. It was wrong. Completely, catastrophically wrong. But it was what virtually every doctor and official and government minister believed. One man knew the truth. Dr. John Snow was a London physician who had spent years studying cholera, watching where it struck and where it didn't, interviewing survivors, mapping cases onto street plans. In 1854, during an outbreak in the Soho neighborhood, he proved it. He mapped every death on Broad Street and its surrounding roads. The deaths clustered with mathematical precision around a single water pump on Broad Street. He went to the local parish board and convinced them to remove the handle from the pump. The outbreak stopped almost immediately. Snow published his findings. He argued that cholera was waterborne, that it was carried in sewage-contaminated water, not in the air. Nobody believed him. The medical establishment dismissed him. The government ignored him. The commission reviewed his evidence and concluded formally that there was no reason to accept his hypothesis. John Snow died in June 1858, at the age of 45, during the very summer of the Great Stink, without ever knowing that he was right. He was right. By the summer of 1858, the Thames had reached a state that no one alive had ever seen before. 3 million people's waste, along with the output of hundreds of factories, tanneries, slaughterhouses, gasworks and chemical plants, poured into it daily. The river's foreshore, the mudflats exposed at low tide, was thick with black oozing sediment that was essentially compressed sewage. There were no fish. There was no wildlife. There were no boats for pleasure. The Thames was a dead river running through the center of the world's greatest city, and in the heat of that extraordinary summer, it was doing what dead organic matter does in extreme heat. It was rotting. The smell that summer was not merely unpleasant, it was an assault. Contemporary accounts describe grown men fainting near the riverbank. They describe a physical sensation of the smell, a weight, a thickness in the air, something that could be felt in the chest. The Punch magazine cartoon of that summer showed death itself rowing calmly down the Thames, skeletal in a black cloak with the caption, "Your money or your life." It was not satirical exaggeration. It was accurate reporting. And then the smell reached Parliament, and something changed. Within 18 days of Disraeli rising from his seat with a handkerchief over his face, Parliament had passed legislation. 18 days. For an institution that had been debating London's sewage crisis for a decade without action, that had rejected plan after plan for financial reasons, that had watched tens of thousands of Londoners die of cholera without reforming the water supply. 18 days. The bill authorised the Metropolitan Board of Works to borrow £3 million and build a new sewer system for London. It was at that point the single largest public works expenditure in English history. The man who would build it had been waiting. Joseph Bazalgette was 40 years old in 1858. He was short and slight and had a face that photographs make look permanently exhausted, which makes sense. He had nearly worked himself to death once already, suffering a serious breakdown in 1847 that forced him to leave London to recuperate in the countryside. He had come back, as driven men do, and had been appointed chief engineer of the Metropolitan Board of Works in 1856. He had been submitting plans for a new sewer system for 2 years. They had been rejected, revised, rejected again, sent to consultants, sent back, debated, amended, rejected once more. The board kept asking for cheaper alternatives. Bazalgette kept telling them there were none. Then the Great Stink happened, and suddenly, money was not the problem. Bazalgette's plan was staggering in its ambition. He had reviewed 137 proposals from engineers across the country, 137, before settling on his own design. The fundamental problem with London's existing sewers was not just that they were inadequate, it was that they ran in the wrong direction. They all ran north-south, carrying waste toward the Thames. They emptied into the river right in the middle of the city, where millions of people lived and drank. What Bazalgette proposed was a completely different geometry. Instead of north-south sewers draining into the Thames in the center of the city, he would build a network of massive east-west intercepting sewers running parallel to the river, one on each bank, that would catch the flow from all the existing north-south drains before it could reach the Thames. These intercepting sewers would carry everything, every drop of London's sewage, far east past the populated areas, to outfall points beyond the city, where it could be held in vast reservoirs and discharged into the river only at high tide, when the current would carry it out to sea. The scale was almost incomprehensible. 82 miles of main intercepting sewers, more than 1,000 miles of smaller connecting street sewers, pumping stations at strategic points to lift the sewage over hills, around obstacles, through the geological complexities of London's underground. And because the sewers ran parallel to the river, and the river had embankments, low walls of stone along the bank, Bazalgette would simply build the intercepting sewers inside new embankments. He would push the bank of the Thames outward, into the river itself, building a new shoreline with the sewers hidden inside it, and on top of the embankments, he would build roads and gardens. The Victoria Embankment, the Albert Embankment, the Chelsea Embankment, the elegant riverside promenades that Londoners still walk today, are the rooftops of Bazalgette's sewers. He made one other decision that turned out to be the most important of all. His calculations told him the sewers needed to be a certain diameter to handle London's waste. He made them larger, not slightly larger, significantly larger. He calculated the population growth of London, tried to project decades into the future, decided the number he arrived at was probably too conservative, and then doubled it. Every sewer pipe he built was built to handle twice the load that strict engineering necessity required. He was designing not for 1858 London, but for the London of 100 years hence. When a colleague asked him why he was making them so large, Bazalgette reportedly said that if he ever made a mistake, he would rather have made them too big than too small. Construction began in 1859. What followed was 16 years of work that transformed the city from below. The scale of the operation was unlike anything London had seen. At its peak, thousands of men worked simultaneously across dozens of sites, spread across the entire metropolitan area. In the east, they dug deep shafts into the clay and built tunnels by hand, brick by brick, through ground that constantly threatened to collapse. In the center, they cut open the streets, major arteries, residential roads, back alleys, and laid pipes, then sealed them and repaved the surface above. Along the river, they drove wooden and iron pilings into the Thames mud and began constructing the embankments, working in cofferdams pumped dry against the constant pressure of the tidal river. The demand for bricks was so extreme that it drove up prices and wages across the entire construction industry. Bazalgette required 318 million bricks to line the tunnels, a number so large that entire new brickmaking operations were established to supply the project. He also insisted on a specific kind of mortar, Portland cement, which had only recently been developed, and which was far stronger and more water-resistant than the traditional lime mortar that most construction used. Workers were not always happy about the insistence on Portland cement. It was harder to work with, required more precision, dried faster. Bazalgette checked their work personally. The Board of Works archives contain thousands of hand-drawn plans, with his notes written in Indian ink. Approved JWB. Not approved. I do not like this. Redo. The handwriting of a man who understood that if any part of this system failed, the failure would be underground and invisible until it was catastrophic. The pumping stations were the crowning achievements of the project, and they were designed not just to function, but to announce themselves. The Victorians believed that infrastructure of this importance deserved buildings of corresponding grandeur. The Abbey Mills pumping station in Stratford, built between 1865 and 1868, was called the Cathedral of Sewage by those who saw it. Its exterior was Gothic and Byzantine in style, arched windows, ornamental ironwork towers. Inside, 8 massive beam engines with 28-foot flywheels drove the sewage up from the low-lying eastern sewers and into the outfall pipes that carried it to the Thames estuary. The machinery was painted and gilded. The floors were tiled. The engine house had a painted ceiling. These were engines designed to be seen, to inspire confidence, to demonstrate that the civilization that had built them was serious about what it was doing. The Crossness pumping station at the southern outfall was even more ornate, a cast-iron interior of such elaborate decorative detail that Victorian observers compared it to a cathedral nave. The ironwork was painted in multiple colors, the columns were decorated with scrollwork and flowers, the floor was polished stone. It was simultaneously the most functional and the most beautiful industrial building in England. Bazalgette, a quiet and methodical man who almost never sought personal attention, built these stations as monuments, not to himself, but to the project, to the principle that London's health was worth celebrating. There was tragedy in the work. Men died in the tunnels, from collapses, from gas explosions, from the ordinary brutal dangers of digging through the earth of one of the world's oldest cities, which was riddled with old foundations, forgotten wells, buried rivers, and pockets of methane. Records of the specific casualties are incomplete, as was typical for Victorian construction projects, where workers were often not named in official accounts. There were also the Toshers, the men and boys who had for generations made their living in London's old sewers, scavenging for valuables washed down from the streets, coins, jewelry, bones, anything that could be sold. The old sewer network was being demolished and replaced, and the Toshers' world was disappearing beneath their feet, literally. The project ran over budget. The initial authorization of £3 million had more than doubled by the time the main works were complete in the mid-1870s. The final cost was over £6.5 million, an extraordinary sum, the equivalent of hundreds of millions today, representing the largest single expenditure of public money in Victorian England. There were political battles throughout. There were contractors who cut corners and had to be dismissed. There were neighbourhoods that objected to the construction tearing up their streets. There were property owners along the Thames who lost their river access when the embankments were built and who had to be compensated. Bazalgette navigated all of it, year after year, without significant scandal and without a single major structural failure. The main drainage system was declared operational in stages. The northern low-level sewer was completed first, then the northern high-level and middle-level sewers, then the southern system. Queen Victoria opened the main outfall works at Crossness in April 1865, arriving by royal barge to a ceremony attended by the Prince of Wales and various dignitaries. By 1875, the entire system was fully operational. 16 years after the first shovel went into the ground, London had a sewer network capable of handling the waste of its entire population. The effects were not immediately understood. The miasma theory still dominated medical thinking, and even Bazalgette himself, in his public statements, framed the project as one of eliminating foul air, eliminating the conditions that produced the miasmatic vapors believed to cause disease. He was building the sewer for the wrong reason, based on the wrong science, and yet almost immediately the cholera epidemic stopped. There was an outbreak in 1866 in the east of London, precisely in the area that had not yet been connected to the new sewer network, that killed nearly 6,000 people. It was the last major cholera epidemic in London's history. As the new sewers came online in the east, the disease disappeared. When the network was complete, cholera was gone. Typhoid fell dramatically. Typhus fell. The death rate in London began to decline in ways that confounded anyone trying to attribute the change to medical advances, because there had been none. Something else had happened. John Snow had been right. The sewers, built on the premise that bad smells caused disease, worked because contaminated water caused disease. By separating the sewage from the drinking water, by carrying the waste east away from the city, away from the pumps and the wells and the river intake points, Bazalgette's system had done exactly what Snow said needed to be done, for exactly the wrong stated reason. History is occasionally like this. The right action taken for the wrong reason producing the correct outcome anyway. When Snow's waterborne theory was finally vindicated by Robert Koch's identification of the cholera bacterium in 1883, Snow had been dead for 25 years. Bazalgette was still alive, still working, running the sewer network he had built. In 1875, Queen Victoria knighted him. In 1883, he was elected President of the Institution of Civil Engineers, the highest professional honor his field could offer. He continued working until 1889, when the Metropolitan Board of Works was dissolved and replaced by the London County Council. He retired to Wimbledon and spent 2 years riding horses in the mornings, saying that he found it excellent exercise for counteracting a sedentary life. He died on March 15, 1891, at the age of 72. His obituaries were respectful but brief. He was not a famous man in the way that Victorian England produced famous men, not a general, not an explorer, not a politician. He was an engineer. What he had built was underground, invisible, unglamorous, and essential. The monument to him on the Victoria Embankment, the one built over his own sewers, is a stone bust in a niche, visible if you know to look for it, overlooking the Thames that he had cleaned. The numbers of what his system prevented are almost impossible to comprehend. Between 1850 and 1900, deaths from cholera and typhoid in London fell by a factor of 500. In the 1848 epidemic, 14,000 Londoners had died. By the 1890s, annual cholera deaths in the city numbered in the dozens, then in the single figures, then zero. Historian after historian has concluded that Joseph Bazalgette's sewer network saved more lives than any other single public health intervention in Victorian England. More than any hospital, more than any medical discovery, more than any act of parliament related to health. Sir Alexander Macara, former chairman of the British Medical Association, put it plainly. Without the sanitary revolution that Bazalgette led, Britain's position as a world power in the second half of the 19th century could not have been maintained. There is a specific irony at the center of this story that deserves to be said clearly. The Great Stink, the crisis that finally forced Parliament to act, happened in part because of a previous, well-intentioned government intervention that made everything worse. Edwin Chadwick, trying to improve London's sanitation, had ordered the cesspits drained into the sewers. The sewers flowed into the Thames. The Thames was the drinking supply. His solution to one problem had created a worse one. It took another decade of cholera epidemics and one catastrophic summer of heat to force the political will to build what should have been built far earlier. The sewers Bazalgette built are still there. Right now, beneath the streets of London, beneath the roads and the underground lines and the gas pipes and the electrical cables, the brick-lined tunnels that his workers built by hand in the 1860s are carrying the city's waste. They have been carrying it without significant structural failure for over 150 years. They are beginning to struggle. London's population has grown to 9 million, nearly 3 times what it was when Bazalgette designed his system, and his famously generous calculations are finally being exceeded, which is why a new super sewer, the Tideway Tunnel, has been under construction in recent years. It will run alongside Bazalgette's original intercepting sewers, handling the overflow. It is, in a sense, the Victorian sewer's successor, but it was not the one that saved the city. That was done by a short, quiet engineer with ink-stained hands, who checked every connection himself, who made every pipe larger than necessary, who built pumping stations beautiful enough to be cathedrals, and who did more to protect human life in London than anyone who ever held a sword or sat on a throne or stood at a podium. He built it underground where no one could see it and the city lived.